Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another installment in the Sydney Railroad build. If you were watching last week, you will have seen me start work on a small sample of scenery, around about 15 square feet. This week I'm just going to continue where I left off and get the scene finished. So without further ado, let's just head out to the workshop and get it done. In this first slide we can see the area more or less as I left it last time. Actually, I have put a little bit more plaster cloth on the right hand side, the other side of the benchwork joint, but it's still basically the end point from the last video. In this view I have started installing the rockwork. I have used a few rock moulds on this area, although most of it is hand carved. And the trick with getting hand carved rock to look right is to copy any nearby castings instead of doing something completely different, because the rock moulds that produce the carvings are themselves created from real rocks. And from memory, I think this represents one morning's work. That day when I went in for lunch, I found that my shaper sheet had been delivered. So that afternoon I left the rockwork as it was and I started working on getting the right side of the scene caught up. You can see here I'm creating a tunnel liner for the solid rock bore, using the double stack to test clearances. And here it is with the tunnel liner installed, ready for me to stack foam over it and blend it in. And here it is with the foam blocks stacked up around the support post, and we can see that I used a few offcuts of 1 inch thick foam, which happens to be a different colour. It all came from Lowe's, it's just two different batches. Here it is after carving it and covering it up with the plaster cloth. So now this end is caught up with the rest of the scene. In this next series of slides I'm going to show the steps with blending castings and carvings together. We can see here that I've got two rock moulds side by side, and of course there is always going to be a small gap between them which is going to need blending in. Here we can see the area with the moulds removed, and you may note that a fairly large chunk of one of the castings cracked off, so I just removed it and I will fill in that whole gap with hand carving. Also there's another chunk that wasn't properly stuck down at the bottom. You can see that missing. Now here it is with additional plaster put into all the gaps and hand carved, and I think this is a good example of what I said earlier, just copying what's already there rather than trying to do something completely different. Here I am gradually extending the carving further to the left, including a few isolated areas higher up in the scene. In this view I have another casting setting up above the tunnel portal, and the middle of this frame shows the man-made rock cut. Note of course that needs to be a completely different texture to the natural rocks. Now here is another view of the same area, with the rock work on the left side of the scene just about done. In this view I've gone back to the other end to start working on the right side, and I started off with the rock outcrop that hides the support post, and here I used the same rock mould twice, and once again I will blend in the gap between them with hand carving. Here it is with that joint blended in, along with the rock cut leading into the tunnel bore. Here I've extended the rockwork forward in a couple of places, and at this point I realised that the area in front of the rock tunnel wasn't quite right. I needed a tall retaining wall there, otherwise it was never going to look right. Here it is with a tall concrete retaining wall installed and blended in. Once again it is scratch built out of styrene sheet and strips. In this view I've finished off the rock carving in front of that new retaining wall and a few other places as well. And here is an overall view of the scene with all the rock carving completed. The next step is to get some colour on it. In this view you can see that I have covered everything with dark washes. First I use a heavy black wash, and then I hit parts of it with a dark brown wash. And the first thing that's going to be immediately obvious in this view is the whole thing is very much too dark, and that's just the nature of it. Don't worry, it will lighten up a lot when I dry brush it. At this point I just want to make sure that there is no bare white showing. I need to ensure that all the plaster is stained. And here is the transformation with the dry brushing. Whereas the previous step took only a few minutes, the dry brushing is probably half a day's work on an area this size. But I think it's time well spent. It is of course important to make sure that the washes that I put on the previous day are completely dry, and if in doubt, leave it an extra day. That's largely going to depend on the humidity in the area that you're working. With all the rock coloured, now it's time to start working on the dirt areas. And the first step here is to fill in all those areas and build up the right contours with sculptor mould. And so that I don't get bare white areas showing through later, I start by mixing a cupful of dark brown paint in with the sculptor mould. For some reason it looks a lot lighter here. Maybe I didn't put in quite as much as I do normally. And in most cases I end up using the same paint that I buy for the fascia. Once the sculptor mould is installed, I then paint full strength white glue over it and sprinkle on sifted dirt, which I dig up from my backyard, and then put through a tea strainer to get rid of all the large lumps. It's difficult to see how far I've gone in this view because the dirt in my backyard is not that different in colour from the paint that I put in the sculptor mould. Now here is the scene with all the ground cover done. I've finished putting on the dirt and various shades of ground foam. I dump 4 or 5 different colours into the same jug, and I don't mix it properly. I want to make sure the colours are patchy, and also that some of the dirt shows through. Also not so clear in this view. During that stage I also install a few broken up twigs to represent fallen limbs from trees, and also the occasional boulder, which I make from all the plaster chips that I carved away in earlier steps and stained using the same paint that I use for the rockwork. Here is a close-up view of the area in the middle, and here I'm ready to reinstall the bridge. Note how there's a few inches at the end that hasn't been ballasted. There's also a little bit of ballast missing on the top track. That's where the track crosses the benchwork joint, and it's a lot easier to leave that out until after the layout is reinstalled in its final resting place. It's easy to build a rock face across a benchwork joint. What I do there is build it from one end up to the joint, leaving a rough edge, and then I put a piece of plastic, usually a strip from a grocery bag, over the end of the rockwork before continuing on the next section. That way they can't stick together. But when I take it apart and reassemble it, the joint will be pretty much invisible. And as long as it's not straight, it doesn't draw attention to itself anyway, since natural rock always has loads of cracks in it. In this view I have installed the bridge, although I have not yet weathered it. I'm just weighting it down while the glue sets. And here it is with the weight removed. Here is an overall view of the scene. Not quite done. I won't be pouring the water in this scene because I don't like doing that until I've finished working in the surrounding areas. I think that's much better to be done as the last step after it's reassembled in the client's room. Although in this view I have weathered the bridge and the culvert behind it. Also in this view you can see that I have painted a tree line on the horizon. That is very simple to do. I just mixed up a fairly dark green. I think it was Christmas green with some black in it, and I use a 1-inch chip brush with not too much paint on it, and I just use short vertical strokes, which I think gives a reasonable approximation of a distant tree line. Here is another view taken from about the same angle with all the trees installed, and although it's possible to add a lot more details, this is as far as I'm going to take it unless the customer asks for more. Here is a closer view of the end with the rock tunnel, and here is a closer view of the other end with the twin tunnel bores. And looking back at this I realise that I haven't painted the soot stains over the tunnels, which is definitely an oversight. Normally I would do that, but we can just chalk it up as one of those many details that can be done at any time. A model railroad is never finished, and even scenes that look finished can still have a lot more added to them. Anyway, that is just about a wrap for this project. I'm going to go back to the full view one more time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and you found it useful, and I hope to see you back next week. Not quite sure what I'm going to produce then, but I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.